If you ever wondered whether we've missed something fundamental about how the body actually works, this video is for you. So, over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time studying mitochondria, circadian biology, and also bioelectricity. And recently I came across the work of Harold Saxton Burr. And today I want to walk you through the research, why it was largely forgotten, and why some of today's leading bioelectricity researchers believe he was decades ahead of his time. And Burr believed genes don't organize biology, electric fields do. So why does Burr matter? So if you look at medicine today and biology today, like for the last 50 years, it's all been about genes and biochemistry. So the whole pharmaceutical industry is built on this belief. And bioelectricity, despite decades of research, has never really become a central framework of the medicine. And Harold Saxton Burr spent more than 40 years as professor of anatomy at Yale University of Medicine, and he published more than 90 scientific papers. He was funded by the NIH, and while he was a pioneer, mainstream biology ultimately sidelined him, and because his conclusions went a step too far for his time. So what did he believe? He believed that the electrical fields direct matter, and that biology is organized by the field first, and then the chemistry is following it. And the mainstream biology adopted the opposite view. So the genes and biochemistry direct matter, and electrical activity is just a downstream consequence of those chemical processes. And if you really want to understand bioelectricity and what it could mean for human health, you really have to start with Burr. So a lot of you following my work have probably heard about Robert O. Becker and especially his book, The Body Electric. And Becker directly took off where Burr stopped. And in the first chapters of his book, he actually writes that Burr was dismissed as a foggy vitalist. And the other biologist at this time, Lund, also suffered the same fate. And he also writes that no one really bothered to see if the measurements they've made were valid. He also writes, after all, you can disagree with the theory, but you should respect the data enough to check them. If you can't duplicate them, you're entitled to rest easy with your own concepts. But if you get the same results, you're obligated to agree or propose an alternate theory. Most scientists took the easy way out, however, and simply ignored Burr and Lund. So his conclusions were ignored. And after Robert O. Becker died, and you can argue he was cancelled because of what he said about electromagnetic fields and how they affect our health on the 60-Minute show. So, his lab he never really got funding, and he really retired quite early for his age. I think he was in his mid-50s when his lab was shut, and he had to retire. And today, if you look at the bioelectricity field, the leading researcher is Michael Levin at Tufts, and the work of Burr is on the recommended reading list of Levin. And Levin actually recently wrote in a paper that he views Burr as a visionary, and that his main hypothesis that bioelectric gradients serve as pre-patterns guiding morphogenesis has been confirmed using modern molecular physiology, as have his ideas about the place of cancer and the nervous system in the question of biological organization. So the leading researcher in the bioelectricity field says that Burr and his ideas were vindicated. And to really give you background who he was, he was a professor at Yale, and what he discovered is there's such a thing, and he called it L field, and L stands for life, so life field. And he really starts with the argument, if you really look at, anyone's face, so all the protein is turning over roughly every 6 months. So if you see someone, if you haven't seen them for 6 months, if you see them again, like all the proteins in their face, I knew. And he asks well, but what holds the structure? Like, what is the mold? Like, what is the matrix? Well, why is the structure kind of the same? And what he says is that, chemistry is the material and it is important, but chemistry has no direction. And the field is what gives us this form, and this is what gives direction. And so Michael Levin talks about it as well. So if you look at, you would think like organs and things like that, how organs are built, it's all in our DNA, but it isn't. It's actually is influenced by bioelectricity, and it is influenced by the fields. And so, it's always been very hard to measure the fields. And I think Burr was the first one who kind of invented his own technology to measure them because they are so delicate. And he explicitly says that the fields have nothing to do with EKG from your brain or EEG from your heart. Like, this is a very specific field that is direct current, so it's DC current. And he said that chemistry can no more change an inferior nervous system into a better one than high-test gasoline can convert a Ford into a Rolls-Royce. So chemistry supplies the energy, but the L field is which gives the direction to the flow. What he says, like whether you have a Ford or Rolls-Royce, it's really determined by bioelectricity and not by the chemistry. And so what are the interesting findings I found from his work? I think the first one is that if you look at embryology, so what he did, he took the unfertilized salamander eggs, and they used a certain method to map the voltage gradients across different axes. And before fertilization even occurred, the location of the steepest voltage gradient predicted where the head of the nervous system would later appear. So before even a conception occurred, there was already an axis before fertilization. So, and it didn't shift regardless of where the sperm entered. And so when the eggs developed, the salamander's nervous system always grew along the axis with the highest voltage gradient. So you can kind of argue that the field is really primary, and the structure really follows the field. So the field really determines what happens in your body. And Michael Levin also has done great work, and he also talks about it, where he studies planaria. Those are kind of worms, and he, just by changing bioelectricity, he could give the worms two heads. And he argued then nothing in the DNA changed. They just changed the field, and the planaria had two heads. And then so he argues, well, if someone would find this planaria in, let's say, 2,000 years from now, and they didn't know what happened, then they would assume that, this two-headed planaria, it's kind of in their DNA. But DNA is literally the same DNA as the planaria with swine had. And what's interesting, like this bioelectrical field, it gets transferred to the next generations. So really, if you change the field, you really change how the body develops. The other part, which is very important, is how bioelectricity relates to cancer. So what Burr in his work, what he did and what he studied, he says that like a bettered L field, meaning one with abnormal voltage patterns, gives an advanced warning of something going out of shape before clinical signs appear. So what's a tough challenge is in cancer is that before you even can do an image on cancer or you find out about cancer, cancer probably has been growing in your body for around 5 years. Like Gabor Sommelier talks about it. And so before you can detect the cancer cells on the technology we use today, cancer has been growing for almost 5 years. So you didn't detect it for the 5 years. And what Burr argued is that you could really tell malignancy just by measuring the L fields. And what he also told is that you don't even need to kind of intervene into a body, do a biopsy, because the field, like in physics, like everything, it's not just local, it's kind of radiates, right? So what they did, they measured in 1,000 gynecological patients in Bellevue Hospital. They measured a voltage shift between the cervix and the abdominal wall, and 95 of 105 cases that were flagged as malignant were confirmed by biopsy. So before they even did a biopsy, the cancer cases were confirmed. And also the same principle, which I find very interesting, extended to psychiatry. So there was an electrometric investigator, and he had no access to psychiatric records, and he just sorted the patients by voltage pattern into certain groups. And then his groupings matched the psychiatric staff who knew like what diagnosis people had. They were confirmed. So just by looking at the voltage fields, he could predict whether someone had mental illness or not. And they even in the book, they even tell like one medical student in the group, he consistently showed higher potential difference than the others. And investigations actually revealed a history of emotional instability. And before the year ended, he became definitely psychotic and was admitted to psychiatric institutions, which I find very interesting. So the field actually changed before the diagnosis was possible. So I think it's very interesting, and I haven't looked into it very deeply, like if there are like any technologies that could be used today to really measure the field and diagnose things like cancer. I'm pretty sure there might be, but I'm not aware that everyone is using them in the hospitals, and anyone using them to diagnose things like cancer. So this finding I found very interesting. And then another one is actually related to his work on trees. So what he did, he got an NIH grant and he studied trees for 30 years. So he measured 4 things in trees. So he had 2 trees. I think they were separated by like 50 miles. So one was an elm tree, the other was a maple tree. And then he also measured earth potential and air potential. So basically those 4 points. And what he found out is the maple, the elm, the air, and the earth all showed increases in positivity at the same time. So the magnitude differed, but the timing was simultaneous. And so he could observe certain patterns across the day. So from midnight until sunrise, the gradients remained relatively low and constant. And with daylight, they increased markedly, usually reaching a peak around noon. And even beyond this daily rhythm, he also saw a repeating cycle approximating the lunar period, like appearing constantly across the year of recordings. And beyond the lunar cycle, he also saw the correlations with sunspot activity. And he also says that Harlan Stetson of MIT has already shown that changes in the ionosphere significantly affect radio reception. So he applied the same logic to biology. If the ionosphere is electrically altered by sunspot activity and living systems are embedded in that field, then L fields of living organism cannot be isolated from those changes. So so he's saying that our life on the planet, our health, is not isolated from the cosmic forces. And I find it very interesting because I also recently did a thread on George Lahovsky, who also believed that lunar cycles and sunspot activity affect our health. And so when we think about radiation from the space, a lot of people, they just think about sunlight, but very few think about how moon cycles affect our health, and very few think about how even things like sunspots, which are actually just like volcanoes on the sun, how they affect our health. And I think it's well known in hospitals and psychiatric institutions that, for example, during full moon, there are like more people getting admitted to those institutions, which I find interesting because both Burr and Lahovsky said that you could actually kind of predict, maybe predict even civil unrest and wars just based on those cycles. And it went even further. So one of the investigators during this time, Dr. Ravitz, he made more than 50,000 measurements across 430 human subjects. And he actually found that the voltage rhythms reflected how people felt. So when they felt on top of the world, their voltages were high. And when they felt below par, their voltages were low. So in health, even in health, like it's not just about disease and health. It's like even in healthy individuals, there are like voltage rhythms that form steady, regular curves that change little over a long period of times. And so what Burr argued is that it was possible to predict in advance when an individual would be at their best and when they would feel below par. And based on that, he said that at population level, periods of peak sunspot activity correlated with unusual worldwide rest, riots, and disturbances. So he posed the same simple question: if mankind becomes more excitable during those periods of increased sunspot activity, could this knowledge be of value to world leaders? Yeah. And another thing I found very interesting is that emotions. So, if you look at the good doctors, they just don't look at your body. They also look at your emotional state and whether you are in alignment with your purpose or not, and how, let's say, like an unhappy marriage or stress at work affect your health. And people the good doctors kind of know about it, but they're like very few can understand like how does it work mechanistically. And so what the same Dr. Ravitz did at Burr's lab at Yale, so they actually recorded a 14 millivolt voltage rise sustained by a woman for 2.5 minutes when she recalled grief. So she was hypnotized, and when she recalled grief, they saw this voltage rise. So it was not just subjective; it literally affected her bioelectrical field. And so what Ravitz actually argued is that both emotional activity and stimuli of any sort involve mobilization of electrical energy, as indicated on the galvanometer. And hence, both emotion and stimuli evoke the same energy, and motions can be equated with energy. So, and Burr goes even further. So the state of the mind is actually reflected in the state of the field. And Burr explicitly talks about, it's not unreasonable to think that, an unhappy marriage or like business worries that, they directly affect your L fields. And he even said like, it is not hard to imagine how business worries on unhappy marriage can produce ulcers. So why does it matter to me? Why am I so interested in it? So I find it very interesting because one of the topics I'm most interested in is cancer. And if you look at cancer, a lot of the discussion in cancer is about genes and, nuclear genes, mitochondrial genes. But I think one of the aspects of cancer that is under-discussed is the aspect of bioelectricity. So Michael Levin showed in his lab that just by manipulating bioelectricity, you can induce cancer without even changing the genes. Or vice versa, just by, changing the bioelectricity, you could kind of cure cancer. Because you change how the cells communicate. And so if you understand that, healthy cells can become cancerous if there's improper electrical signal, then you also understand that, things like EMFs or things like grounding, they all kind of start making sense. So, and I find this is kind of directly, so I see the link directly. So, for instance, when you ground, there's been a research that when you suffer jet lag and when you land in a new area and you ground first thing, let's say for 20-30 minutes, then you kind of can almost eliminate jet lag. And so what is happening, you kind of pick up the frequencies and vibrations from this local place where you are, and you kind of align with the local environment. And the same thing, I think, if you understand that, all those frequency, the cosmic radiation, it kind of affects, the vibrations in our body. Then you also understand that, if you then now put all these electromagnetic fields around us, that also, we don't see them, but they're affecting our health. It's not hard to see the link between, cancer and electromagnetic fields if you follow this logic cleanly. So what does it mean for me? I think, the field is still kind of early. What I find a little bit disappointing that there are not many people actually studying it. So you have Michael Levin, you have some other people today who studies it, but they're like, it would be really nice to kind of have more people doing it and, having different ideas and maybe not coming to the same conclusions. And yeah, so I think all we have is this work. And as Levin writes himself, like this is like, what Burr did is kind of, it's still at the frontier of inquiry that awaits today's researchers. So a lot of questions are still unanswered. But I think bioelectricity, I will definitely be looking more into it, and will be covering it in my posts and in these videos, because I think this is one of those aspects that is underappreciated, and it will be really interesting to know, well, how can you affect the bioelectricity of your body so it's in the optimal, in the Goldilocks range, so you don't get things like cancer, and you feel at your peak, and you really live in sync with this part of your biology. So it just does its work and you don't mess up with it. So I think, the job of biology is not just to do chemistry, it also to explain what organizes it. See you in the next one. Thanks.